what I will present is a little bit of a mixture, because we are also involved in a JPI Urban Europe project, which is called Inclusive Housing. Policies Housing is the Beginning. And we are doing it in cooperation. So I'm from Caritas Vienna, one of the biggest NGOs in Austria. And we are doing it in cooperation with the University of Vienna Institute of Sociology, with the DIFO, so the German Institute of Urban Affairs, and with Umeå in Sweden, with the University of Umeå, the Institute of Geography and Social Work. And so I think some of our questions are quite similar to your GPI project. And so I will talk a little bit of this transnational project first. And then I will also bring some, some reflections about the question of the Ukrainian refugees. But this again, since my focus is Vienna, is more focused on the situation in Vienna and Austria, and maybe complements a little bit what Caroline already said. So I prepared some slides. Yeah.
You should have co-host and should be able to share screen.
Yeah, I will try. Let's see. Yeah. Do you see it? Okay, fine, this is working. Yeah. So as I said, here are the institutions participating in our project. So the project Inclusive Housing. Yeah, I already said the participating cities. So it's also Vienna, Austria, Hamburg, Germany, and Umeå, Sweden. And we started, yeah, it's like similar. We started in April and finalizing our project now. And basically we had three steps. So first one was like a deeper status analysis, a thing not so easy to try to analyze and compare the housing market situations, but also migration regimes in the three countries involved. Then the core of the project were three transnational workshops where we also involved practice partners and stakeholders. So our first workshop was 1 year ago. It was the topic of housing market and access to housing in Vienna. Our second workshop was in Umeå and was more about, when we talk about inclusive housing, what forms of inclusive housing can there be? And so also talking about maybe special types of housing. And the third workshop was just now in Hamburg, then had the topic housing governance, and also especially different forms of forming alliances. And I think as we are seeing now already, this forming new alliances is like, I think, quite crucial for finding solutions for the housing situation, especially when there's a rapid influx. So it's all about this ability to form alliances. Yeah, and of course, the transfer of results. I think it's also a good opportunity to be talking to you right now as representative of our project. Just short also what we plan on publication. So we are, as outputs for the three workshops, we are doing three thematic policy briefs. And the first one is already available on our website, and the second and third one are still in elaboration, but should be coming out soon. And what we are also doing is as a booklet with practice examples, because I think similar as maybe in your project, it was also interesting when we did go to different cities to have excursions and to get to know concrete projects and practice examples better. And so we summarized them and researched some others, and trying to put them together also in a kind of booklet. Yeah, I think yeah, I'm not will not say very much, but just some impressions from the status analysis in the beginning, because we saw, I think maybe as you as well, it's not that easy to compare the housing situations in different countries where housing markets partly function very differently. And so this is just a quick overview of how the housing stock is composed. And so this would be for the countries, Austria, Germany, and Sweden. But of course, for instance, if you look to Vienna, Hamburg, and Umeå, it's different than this also. But I think you can see that, for instance, the housing markets are complex. They have different segments, and each one of the segments also have different access criteria that produce inclusion or exclusion, willingly or not willingly. And yeah, just to talk a little bit about the differences. For instance, Austria has a very strong segment in social housing, municipal housing, but also limited profit housing. And but so it's very crucial, especially there, the access criteria. And in Vienna, this chart would be even bigger, the percentage of social housing, because this is for Austria. In Germany, you officially do not have that much social housing. It depends very much on the cities as well, but you have cooperative housing and municipal housing, but not necessarily it's always social housing. And also in Sweden, you do not have this concept of social housing at all, which was also interesting to learn. But you, even though you have a certain segment of public rental housing and also cooperative housing. And so, of course, some of these stocks especially interesting for the topic. But also you see that in all of the countries, of course, the blue segments, so the private rental or the owner occupied, but especially the private rental, are quite huge segments. And intervening there in making housing markets more inclusive is, of course, a little bit more complicated. Yeah, just to give a little bit of the overview. And also we compared the analysis of migration, and as you see, all this before the Ukraine war, but still you see the percentages of foreigners, and which in general in the last decade has grown in all the countries and all the cities, but of course with different with different numbers. But I think you see a growth there in general. And of course, I don't have the chart here, but of course, also the asylum seekers in all three countries had this peak in 2015, 2016, and are now experiencing, of course, another peak. And as Caroline already put very well, it's people coming from Ukraine, but not only, also the general asylum seekers are growing again. Yeah, and since one of our policy briefs is already published and finished, I can maybe give you, of course, it's a 4 or 5 pages policy brief, but it's about housing market and the access to housing. And so just to give you maybe the bullet points for our recommendations. In the beginning, we said that really housing is such a basis for everything. And so this is why we called it housing is the beginning, because if you don't have a home or a safe place to stay, it's very difficult to worry and think about other things, being school, being labor, being other topics. So housing is really, really the basis. And so we argue for how important it is providing affordable housing. Also, it's not just the affordability, but the access conditions. So it's about the accessibility. So how inclusion and exclusion is produced. And of course, you have a more formal way, for instance, in the social segments, but it's also in the private segments, you have very diverse and informal ways. And I think, as you said, yeah, one of your workshop was about discrimination, etc. I think this really enters there as well. And of course, it's about the financial resources and support structures that can open new possibilities. And knowledge is a key factor to navigate the housing market, because as I said, housing markets are very complex. You have different segments. You have, even for people already born in a country, sometimes it's difficult to understand all the different segments and what do you need to get in where. And so for people that just came and that also have lots of other things from their flight already in their package, it's like it's not so easy to have this orientation. And also what we discussed a lot was the mindsets and practices. So the mindsets of landlords, or the mindsets of housing associations. And so that it's important to work with these stakeholders also to foster alternative actions. And of course, these are maybe quite general recommendations, but we also complement them with concrete practice examples that we found in the 3 countries. So this was a little bit of about our first focus, the housing market. I think in our second workshop, as I said, we do not have the policy brief, but I tried to put a little bit on what we discussed. So it was this idea of special kinds of housing, but we also discussed a lot what makes housing inclusive, as I said. So it's the affordable housing, but it's also the accessible housing. So who can actually access, and what are the barriers and the possibilities to overcome them? Also a question of adequacy. So as you mentioned, sometimes it's the substandard apartments in very bad shape, of course, that are being offered, especially in the private market. So what do we understand adequate housing, healthy housing, and also the question housing being combined with social inclusion. So questions on how do you integrate not just the housing space, but in the neighborhood, which possibilities you have, which support structures such as community work, neighborhood work, and also projects that combine housing and possibilities to enter labor market, to get trainings, etc. And I think we were also discussing, like, you have this continuum. You have, like, on one hand, you have the first accommodation shelters, and so the really the accommodation that is organized by the state for refugees. Then you have maybe some, like, very special projects, or as we heard, these cooperations with NGOs and Housing First and pool housing. But and then you would have simply the normal housing market, and especially the social segments of the housing market would be that open that it would not be a problem to enter. And so we also said that maybe the most inclusive form would be maybe the most invisible, not with special projects or special kinds of housing, but just that housing markets would have the possibility to provide the possibility to include also incoming people and refugees. So, and here I think I will take the point also maybe for the situation now, because in our third workshop we discussed a lot, the topic was housing governance, but I think mainly we discussed a lot this question of the crucial role of alliances. And so we learned about institutionalized cooperation between different actors in a city. For instance, in Hamburg, you have the Alliance for Housing, which interestingly does not have that many NGOs. It's basically between the city and the big housing associations. But in order to really have a program where in the growing city with migrants, with refugees, you have these goals that you want to reach, like each year you want to build like many thousands new units. And so, you know, you need all the actors that are actors in this housing market together. And so they built this alliance, and so I think it's very interesting. But on the other hand, we saw that it would be interesting also to include maybe more the social sector, NGOs, etc., with their perspective, and even it's at beginning a little bit, but even to include more. Then we also discussed the project-based, but generally a more project-based cooperation between housing associations or projects and NGOs. Like Caroline already said, in Vienna, for instance, we have this a lot. We also have a colleague of Wiener Wohnen in our project team and in the stakeholders, and exactly what you said is housing first, but also pool housing units for NGOs. And I think you have it in different cities, but in Vienna, I think your question before was like, if you know the number. I remember that Julia from Wiener Wohnen said, I think for the Ukrainian refugees, it was like 100 units that they already also gave to NGOs to offer them to Ukrainian refugees now in these new situations. But of course, in comparison with the big numbers that we have, it's just like a very small number, of course. And I think you also before asked on how it works. It works as far as I know that you have a contract for 1 year in the beginning, and then it's evaluated and you have the support by the NGOs. And if it functions well, the person or the family can get an indefinite contract. So there are open new pool housing units for the NGOs. Yeah, and also we about the question of knowledge, of course, peer-to-peer support, so multipliers in different communities, in different mother tongues, are also bodies from the autochthone population and civil society initiatives, like for instance, Friend in Ymir or Refugees Welcome in Vienna. In many cases, these initiatives already formed in 2015, but still now for this new situation are playing an important role. Yeah, and here just now going a little bit more to Vienna and Austria. This is in this peer-to-peer support is one of our projects. So my department in Caritas is neighborhood and community work. And so we have a project already for 10 years. So way before the so-called refugee crisis, where we have multipliers from different communities, different countries already living sometime in Vienna, and that are giving informations and helping especially new arrivals in the orientation in Vienna. And so it's interesting that especially this project is one that we were always this new influxes from new countries like 2015, especially Syria or now Ukrainians. This project is a project where this is always we feel very much, because then we have more volunteers also from these languages and trying to especially help the newcoming people. Yeah. And as I said, I think another interesting, more civil society association, for instance, is Refugees Welcome, which was formed in 2015 already. And they, in the question of housing, they had the idea that they convey housing options in shared flats. And so like you have student shared flats from Austrians or people from different parts, and they try to help not just to getting an apartment, because an apartment this is often done by the bigger NGOs, but to make these connections to enter in this way. And yeah, and so I will talk a little bit about yeah, just I think complementing maybe what Caroline already said about because interestingly in our JPI project, differently to yours that I can say, we did not discuss very much how the situation changed now since February with the many Ukrainians coming. I think it's very interesting that your project is so strongly discussing these situations, and I think it's very good because it's so yeah, the topic that of course in our everyday in Caritas it's also like the topic, but in the JPI project it was not that strongly discussed. So but I can bring some of the experiences from Caritas Vienna. And so I think besides the question of rapid provision of information, also on the website, we were involved as other NGOs as well in creating this arrival information at the train stations and emergency first accommodation and information centers. So it was Caritas and of course also Diakonie and other NGOs. And yeah, as I said here, it's very focused on information, helping with registration, with access to financial support, and other projects rapidly developed in Caritas. From what I see from afar, I would say, in the area of integration in labor market and also the organization of housing. I think that that we focused very much on was also, since Caroline said, it's like this, even if you register, but in order to get your financial support, it can take weeks to really get the first money. And so, of course, the person's families are living on what they brought, and some brought some reserves, but other not that much. And so what we organized a lot, and a lot around parishes as well, was free lunch for refugees to cover the need for free food. And so we did this in many different places in the city, mainly with volunteers. And as I said, our peer-to-peer project, for instance, in neighborhood parents, also, yeah, it was a strong focus in the last month, for instance, to really helping people coming from Ukraine. But we also saw, for instance, that for some, it's quite challenging, because there are also some of them also are personally afflicted by the war, because some of them still have relatives in Ukraine or have relatives in Russia, and also people that here were living together well, and now countries are in war. And so it's I think this that our volunteers themselves are quite emotionally involved. Also, it's sometimes quite challenging. What we started also in our community space in one district in Vienna is an initiative that we call Sharing the City, Strengthening Cohesion, so that we do open cafes. We have a community kitchen, and there we organize regular an open cafe. So it's not this official counseling center, but it's like a low threshold thing where people who know about can come, can enter, make contact, can. It's a more yeah, informal way to get answers to your questions as well. And what we also plan is like departing from the needs and the issues of the participants, that we can develop further activities, so get to know some places, some infrastructure in the city. We're inviting some experts on some topics, etc. I think about the question of housing and accommodations, already many things were said. So it was really this idea, I think, to mobilize private spaces, not only, but so on a national level, there is this platform where you could register free accommodations. They call it the Nachbarschaftsquartiere, so the neighborhood accommodations. And I think it's not easy to find like the numbers, but what I found was already in the beginning, that, as you said, there were already in the middle of March, like 6,600 people, companies, communities, and social organizations reported over or nearly 30,000 free quarters and overnight accommodations. And so in the beginning, I think it was possible, as Caroline said, and so far it was always possible to organize housing more or less, but really with a very in a spontaneous ways and way, and with many, yeah, like of course private, but also also I know that municipalities, for instance, talking to housing associations, etc., and so to really mobilize yeah, free housing space where before no one would say that it even exists. I think it's also interesting that if you before said that it was possible to house so many people, everyone would say it's not possible. But of course, for this more the first weeks a month, it seems that it was possible. But of course, many thought, as you already mentioned, that maybe it was not like for a bigger period of time. And so I think, yeah, exactly now it's like the time on seeing how this will go on. And I know, for instance, also from another state, from Upper Austria, that now it's really quite like the state is also talking more to more institutions. So like big qualification centers, spaces more or less state near, that have spaces that they want to use, because I think many private accommodations maybe are being withdrawn already. Yeah, so I also talked with our social worker and the volunteers in our open cafe, and just to finalize, I have maybe some impressions from the conversations in the open cafe, because you asked, so what are the challenges? And so I think and also this question of who is treated how, I think one thing that was very significant for us from the beginning is this different treatment of refugees from Ukraine and refugees from other countries. Of course, it's a good thing that now there was a lot of solidarity possible, and that even the state, but it really changed the rules, because Ukrainians did not have to apply for asylum, they only have to register, and in order to get a temporary permit to live and work in Austria. And so other refugees that we are working for years did not have this procedure, because there are many of them still waiting for their permits now for a long time. And of course, this idea on why does Austria, why do European countries treat different? Like in our project, the neighborhood parents, where I do for years work with many different migrants and refugees, of course, it raises questions also for why there is like first or second class refugees in this case, it seems. And also, as we said, officially they do not even have to apply for asylum. Another thing that struck us was that there is a different treatment also, that it was not important who came from Ukraine, but it was about citizenship. So you had a different treatment for Ukrainian citizens and other citizens who fled from Ukraine. So as far as I know, the simpler procedures for the Ukrainian citizens, I think other European countries do this differently. But in Austria, as far as I know, the case is that other citizens, even coming from Ukraine, they have to apply for asylum, and they are, yes, at risk of being sent back to their original home countries.
Katharina, just to ask you to maybe finish in some minutes, that we have still some time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Of course. I think it's already nearly the last slide.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think also in question of the private accommodations, which is mostly the case, that they are precariat contracts. So it's not the more secure contracts that are foreseen by the tenancy law, and so they really are less stable and have less protection for the tenants. And I think the further challenges are already mentioned. And I think what we've learned so far, so the last slide really, it's that involvement of civil society really was crucial to receive so many refugees in a short period of time. And that already in 2015, there were civil society initiatives. And I think that what we learned is that now the state really tried to promote these cooperations, these alliances between initiatives, but also, as Caroline said, between NGOs and the refugees, and trying to coordinate the search and offer for housing, and also try to really stimulate this idea of private people offering accommodations. And especially in Vienna, I think this new cooperation or stronger cooperation between the city, NGOs, and also owners of housing spaces, of course, it was important to, in a short period of time, open housing space, but providing inclusive forms of housing in a sustainable way, of course, needs more than provisionally organized housing spaces. And so it calls for more inclusive housing markets and a sufficient number of affordable and accessible housing units. And this is why I finish. And thank you very much for your time.